A single machine sitting inside a SMIC cleanroom is running wafers through a verification process that, if it clears, will erase one line item from China's sanctioned imports list. The machine is AMEC's Primo Angnova, an inductively coupled plasma etch tool aimed, per the company's own published roadmap, at 5 nanometers and below. The bullish camp says its 14-nanometer verification run at SMIC is proof China just punched through the Western equipment ban. The skeptical camp says clearing 14 nanometers with a domestic etch tool is a footnote, while ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, the ones no Chinese firm builds, still lock the door to leading-edge production. The restriction that was supposed to settle this contest reopened it. By cutting off foreign etch equipment, the ban pushed China's investment toward domestic etch development, and AMEC is the direct result. The round that should have ended China's run in plasma etch is precisely the round that funded it. Whether that redirection beats the ban itself is a different question, and that is the question being scored here. 3 rounds, 1 decisive, and a tab at the end. Claim, counterclaim, evidence, ruling, in that order, escalating toward the round that decides whether the phrase beats the ban survives contact with the evidence. Etch is one of the few semiconductor equipment categories where a Chinese firm can now say, without overreach, that it manufactures competitive hardware. AMEC launched 4 new tools in a recent product cycle, with the Primo Angnova positioned as the flagship, targeting the sub-5-nanometer process window, the same window occupied by the most advanced nodes at TSMC and Samsung. Plasma etch was a category dominated by Lam Research and Tokyo Electron. For most of the industry's history, the idea of a Chinese-built inductively coupled plasma etch tool in the leading-edge conversation was not a real planning assumption. It is now. AMEC's own product claims position the Angnova at a tier of capability that, if independently confirmed, represents a genuine break from the historical pattern. China buys semiconductor equipment. China does not build it. That sentence has been true long enough that it calcified into an assumption the export control architecture was built on. The structural consequence of cracking that assumption matters more than the commercial consequence. Every tool category where a domestic supplier exists is a category where sanctions enforcement becomes harder. The export control mechanism assumes a foreign monopoly. When the monopoly cracks, the mechanism leaks. A Chinese inductively coupled plasma etch tool that SMIC can order without touching a sanctioned import channel is not just a line item shifted. It is a proof of concept that the category was not as locked as the ban architects believed. The counterclaim is not that AMEC is a fiction. AMEC is a real company with real revenue and a real installed base at older process nodes. The counterclaim is that product launches are not production installations. A company's roadmap positioning a tool at sub-5 nanometers is a marketing claim until independent fabs run production wafers through it and publish yield and uniformity data. The distance between a product launch and a verified production-qualified tool at a leading-edge node is where most ambitious semiconductor equipment roadmaps have historically stalled, including roadmaps from well-capitalized Western firms with decades of process data. The skeptics do not deny that AMEC exists or that the Angnova was announced. They deny that an announcement closes a capability gap. The evidence lands here. AMEC has an established installed base at SMIC and other Chinese fabs at mature nodes, documented commercially and consistent with industry reporting. The sub-5 nanometer roadmap positioning is the company's own claim, and it should be treated as such. No independent third party has published a head-to-head benchmark of the Angnova against Lam Research or Tokyo Electron tools at sub-14 nanometer process conditions. The 4-tool launch figure comes from the company's own reported cycle and is consistent with coverage. But performance verification at the nodes the roadmap targets is a separate question from the launch itself. Round 1 goes to China. Not because the sub-5 nanometer claim is confirmed, it is not, but because the existence of a credible domestic inductively coupled plasma etch tool in the leading-edge conversation is itself a structural change. A category that was a clean foreign monopoly is no longer one, and that shift is real, regardless of where the performance ceiling ultimately sits. Advantage, domestic tooling, with the asterisk that the roadmap and the verification run are still 2 different things. Verification is the meaningful threshold, not announcement. not lab demonstration, but the process of running the tool inside an actual production fab under actual production conditions and determining whether the output meets the fab's yield and uniformity specifications. Reports suggest a 14-nanometer etch process is in verification at SMIC using the Angnova. If that verification run clears, SMIC gains a domestic supplier for a critical etch step at a node it actually produces in volume. That is commercially and strategically significant on two axes simultaneously. It reduces SMIC's exposure to the sanctioned import list, and it gives AMEC a production reference customer at a node that matters, the kind of reference that turns a roadmap into a sales argument with the rest of the Chinese fab ecosystem. The trajectory argument is the stronger version of the bullish case. Verification at 14 nanometers is not production at 5 nanometers, but it is further down the qualification chain than any prior Chinese etch tool has been at a comparable node. The direction of travel is what the bullish camp is betting on, and the direction is up. A tool that has a reported verification run at 14 nanometers inside a volume production fab is a different artifact than a tool that exists only as a datasheet. The gap between those two things is real, and the Angnova appears to have crossed it. The skeptical counterclaim on this round is sharper than the bullish camp acknowledges. 14 nanometers is not the contested node. SMIC already produces at 14 nanometers using tools it acquired before sanctions tightened, or through channels that predate the current control architecture. A new domestic etch tool clearing that bar is an incremental improvement to an existing capability, not a leap into territory the ban was designed to protect. The ban's architecture is built around 7 nanometers, and below, around the lithography steps that define the most critical patterning, and around the extreme ultraviolet machines those steps require. The export control framework targets, among other things, equipment capable of supporting sub-10 nanometer production. 14 nanometers sits outside that target zone. The skeptics concede the qualification run. They contest its significance, and the distinction is important enough to hold on to. The verification run is reported but not confirmed by SMIC in a public disclosure. Whether verification will clear and on what timeline is not publicly known. The gap between 14-nanometer verification and sub-5-nanometer production qualification is not a gap. Any public document from AMEC or SMIC has addressed with a specific timeline. Those are the uncertainty flags that narrow the margin on this round. Round 2 goes to China, but narrowly. The qualification trajectory is real. The strategic consequence of a domestic etch supplier at 14 nanometers is real. The direction of the program is up, but the margin is narrow precisely because 14 nanometers is not where the ban's load-bearing architecture lives, and the gap between where the tool is verified and where the roadmap points is large enough that the skeptics arrive at the next round with a stronger hand. The specific phrase in the doc now is, beats the ban. Etch alone does not. Chipmaking at the leading edge is a chain in which every link must hold. The Primo Angnova, even if it clears 14-nanometer verification and eventually qualifies at sub-5 nanometers, addresses the etch steps in that chain. It does not touch the lithography steps. ASML is the sole manufacturer of extreme ultraviolet lithography systems in the world. That is an established, uncontested industry fact. Those systems have been under export restrictions barring their sale to China, a documented policy in place since at least 2019 under Dutch export controls applied under pressure from the United States. No Chinese firm has publicly demonstrated a production-capable extreme ultraviolet system. That is the consensus of public analyst reporting, and while various Chinese entities have research programs aimed at the problem, no production system has been reported by any credible source. Sub-7 nanometer production at leading-edge fabs requires extreme ultraviolet patterning for multiple critical layers. This is established semiconductor process engineering. Deep ultraviolet multi-patterning can approximate some steps, and SMIC has produced chips reported by analysts to be at roughly 7 nanometers using aggressive deep ultraviolet multi-patterning configurations, but that workaround carries yield penalties, cost penalties, and complexity penalties that compound as the target node shrinks. At sub-5 nanometers, the multi-patterning stacking required becomes geometrically harder in ways that are not simply a matter of adding more process steps. Consider the chain this way. Plasma etch is one step among many, each of which must hit specification for the wafer to yield. AMEC just demonstrated it can hold that one step to specification at 14 nanometers inside a production environment. The chain has more steps. The step that the band's architects identified as the rate-limiting constraint is patterning, and the machine that controls patterning at the leading edge is ASML's, and that machine is not available to any Chinese fab, and no Chinese machine occupies its position. Fixing the etch step in that chain is a meaningful repair. It does not open the chain. The Angnova's sub-5-nanometer roadmap positioning is the company's claim. Independent verification of etch performance at sub-5-nanometer process conditions is not yet publicly documented. The bullish camp is scoring a trajectory. The skeptical camp is scoring a demonstrated fact. The demonstrated fact is 14 nanometers. The roadmap says 5 nanometers. Those are not the same datum, and the distance between them is where the band's remaining enforcement power lives. Round 3 goes to the skeptics, and this is the round with the heaviest evidence. The band's architecture was never about etch in isolation. It was about the single irreplaceable patterning step, and that step remains foreign, restricted, and unmatched by any domestic Chinese alternative. Not yet proven otherwise. Now the Dissent, because a verdict that does not weigh its own weaknesses, is not a verdict. It is a press release. The first challenge is the deep ultraviolet multi-patterning escape route, and it is the most serious. The round 3 verdict assumes extreme ultraviolet patterning is genuinely irreplaceable at sub-7 nanometers, but SMIC's reported roughly 7-nanometer production using deep ultraviolet multi-patterning is the counterexample. If domestic etch tools reduce defect rates and improve uniformity across those multi-patterning stacks, the combination could push usable yields higher at nodes the extreme ultraviolet band was meant to make commercially prohibitive. A domestic etch tool that specifically improves multi-patterning outcomes is not just a replacement for a sanctioned import. It is potentially an amplifier for the workaround strategy China already operates. The Angnova's specific technical contribution to deep ultraviolet multi-patterning stack uniformity is not publicly characterized, and that gap in the public record is where the bullish camp's strongest technical argument lives. The verdict survives this challenge, but narrowly. Multi-patterning yields at sub-7 nanometers with deep ultraviolet tools are reported by analysts to be substantially below what extreme ultraviolet-enabled production achieves at TSMC. The cost and complexity penalties are severe, and at the most aggressive nodes, below 5 nanometers, the stacking required becomes a physical obstacle, not just an economic one. The escape route is real, but narrow, and the Angnova's specific contribution to widening it remains uncharacterized. The second challenge is that verification is not the finish line. Production qualification is, and the evidentiary base for rounds 1 and 2 is thinner than the evidentiary base for round 3. Round 3 rests on documented, public, uncontested facts about ASML and extreme ultraviolet export controls. Rounds 1 and 2 rest on reported progress and company roadmaps. If the verification run stalls, if the Angnova clears early qualification steps but fails on uniformity or defect density at production volumes, both earlier rulings look premature. The verdict holds because it already distinguishes between localized a critical tool and beats the ban. Even if the verification run stalls, the structural argument of round 1 that a credible domestic inductively coupled plasma etch tool now exists in the leading edge conversation survives the stall. The verdict is not hostage to the qualification clearing. The third challenge is that the ban is not static. Export control regimes update, and the history of this particular ban is a history of revisions triggered by Chinese advancement. If China's etch localization progresses to the point where it materially supports leading-edge production through deep ultraviolet workarounds, the policy response is not fixed at current rules. The dissent here is that the verdict scores a moving target as if it were fixed, and the target has moved toward tighter controls every time China made genuine progress. That is a real institutional dynamic, and it means the contest does not end at the current score. The verdict holds because it scores the contest as it stands on current evidence, not as a projection. What future policy rounds produce is a different script. The dissent synthesis. The verdict survives all 3 challenges, but it survives the first one most narrowly. The Angnova's ability to improve uniformity in deep ultraviolet multi-patterning stacks is the specific technical question that would force a reassessment if answered definitively in China's favor. That is the variable to watch, not the sub-5 nanometer roadmap claim. because the roadmap points at a future that requires extreme ultraviolet, while the multi-patterning argument exploits a present that does not. The tab closes here. 2 rounds to China, 1 to the skeptics, and the 1 to the skeptics is the decisive round. AMEC's Primo Angnova represents a genuine localization in a category that was supposed to remain a foreign monopoly. 4 new tools launched, a sub-5-nanometer roadmap published, a 14-nanometer verification run reported at SMIC. None of that is theater. It is real industrial progress in a category that matters, and the direction of travel in both rounds China won is up. But the band's architecture was never a tool-by-tool scoring contest. It was built on a single irreplaceable choke point, extreme ultraviolet lithography, and ASML's machines remain the load-bearing constraint that no verified Chinese tool yet approaches. AMEC fixed one link in a chain that lithography still holds shut. That is a meaningful repair. It is not a jailbreak. The restriction that was supposed to end China's equipment ambitions in Etch instead redirected them. And AMEC is the direct result. The round that should have closed the Etch chapter is the one that opened it. That pattern recurs in this contest, but the pattern has a limit. Redirection works when the redirected energy can reach the target. In Etch, it can. In extreme ultraviolet patterning, the target is further away than any current evidence suggests Chinese redirection can reach on a near-term horizon. The Primo Angnova, aimed at sub-5 nanometers, verified at 14 nanometers, installed at SMIC, is the most advanced domestic etch tool China has put in a leading-edge fab. That sentence is more impressive than it was 5 years ago, and less decisive than the bullish camp claims. Beating the ban, one tool at a time, is a strategy. Whether it is a strategy that reaches extreme ultraviolet patterning before extreme ultraviolet patterning reaches sub-2 nanometer production is the question this contest will take another decade to answer. If you think the deep ultraviolet multi-patterning route makes round 3 closer than this analysis scored it, or if you think 14-nanometer verification is too thin an evidence base to hold round 2, make the argument in the comments. Score the specific round, not the general direction. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want the next verdict when SMIC's qualification data surfaces or when the next tool in this localization chain gets its own announcement.